When I say the word yoga, the first thing that people associate with yoga is an asana practice or a physical practice, right? And that's the first thing that comes onto anybody's mind. If you look at Patanjali Yoga Sutra, who is the father of yoga, and he has 195 sutras that talk about yoga. There's only one sutra that actually talks about the physical practice or asana. Everything else actually deals with the mind. Even with regard to yoga therapy, with regard to research work, there is a lot of research work that has been done to look at practices of yoga, that is the asanas, the breath work, meditation, and how this has an impact on different psychiatric disorders.
Vanakkam, Namaste, and hello everyone. Welcome to the 63rd episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. In today's episode, we have a very special guest, Dr. Raksha Bhide. Dr. Raksha Bhide holds a PhD in yoga and mental health from Department of Psychiatry, NIMHANS. She specializes in clinical yoga therapy for mental health and maternal mental health and has served over 1,000 plus clients. Her research work focuses on developing a holistic treatment for stress disorders and anxiety using clinical yoga, counselling, and mindfulness. As a researcher and a therapist, she is passionate about integrating clinical yoga therapy with scientific research to make a difference in an individual's holistic well-being. She holds a double master's in psychology and yoga therapy. So let's give a big round of applause to Dr. Raksha.
Thank you so much, Swati. Thank you for the introduction.
Hi, Dr. Raksha. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you for joining me, and I'm very excited to hear about your perspectives of yoga. So we'll get started, and the first question that I have for you is, how did your journey of yoga begin?
Okay, so I think very early on, right from my childhood, I was exposed to a lot of philosophy of yoga rather than looking at yoga, I think, as an asana-based practice, because my family was into it, right from my grandparents. So there were stories of Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, that all of us grandchildren would sit and listen to from my granddad, right? And he would always tell us that from Bhagavad Gita verses where it talks about yoga. So I think right from early on, the understanding of yoga to me came about more as a philosophical understanding rather than looking at yoga as an asana-based practice. So I think the exposure to it started back then. And yes, that's how I think the journey went on.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So now I'd like to come into the next question. So I know you have a PhD in yoga, which is very impressive. So I was wondering what inspired you to pursue a PhD in yoga and mental health? What was the inspiration behind that?
Right. So I think my career also took a lot of turns. I was in the corporate space for a long time. And when I decided that that's not my cup of tea, and then I went into this whole sphere of yoga. The thing, interestingly, was that I had a background of psychology and I had a master's in clinical yoga therapy as well. And for my master's research work is when I went into NIMHANS. And NIMHANS is an institution in Bangalore, India, which deals with neurological as well as a lot of mental health conditions, psychiatric conditions. And here, with my master's research work, I was exploring the applicability of Ramayana as a counseling intervention in people with mental health disorders. Right. And yes, so, and working there in NIMHANS was, I think, the point of inspiration because we're exposed to a lot of clinical population who are going through psychiatric disorders, right? And there is also a department there that deals with looking at yoga as an intervention for people undergoing mental health conditions. It looks at it as an integrative department where we look at applying aspects of modern psychiatry, medication, along with yoga and Ayurveda to treat a person as a whole. Right. And that's when I think that inspired me to pick up a PhD there. To look at an individual as a whole and see how yoga can contribute into the journey of healing for somebody with a mental health condition. And that's how my journey started, with a PhD in psychiatry and clinical yoga there.
Well said. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your inspiration behind getting a PhD in yoga, as well as mental health. So now I'd like to come into the next question. So I believe in the introduction, I had mentioned a little bit about you having experience with clinical yoga. So I was wondering if you could first define what clinical yoga is, and then explain how it differs from traditional yoga.
Okay. I think very interesting question. I think, okay, so let's talk about it from the angle of, let's say, disease,
Okay.
health, and wellness, right? So, in a traditional yoga practice, I think when we look at Hatha Yoga, when we look at Ashtanga Yoga, practices such as this, we look at addressing somebody who comes in with a healthy body and a healthy mind, right? And that's the journey they're on. Now, if we look at yoga therapy, we're looking at somebody who comes in with a disease, right? Who's not completely healthy.
Yeah.
So then how do I go about that? So it could be anything. It could be a metabolic disorder. If somebody walks in with diabetes, right? Then if somebody comes in with a metabolic disorder, then I also would need to have an understanding of the comorbidities that they come in with. Somebody with diabetes could also have hypertension, could also have something related to the heart, right? So clinical yoga therapy, or as a therapist, I need to have an understanding of all of this so that I can curtail and modify the practices that I can give this client or the person who walks in, right? Now, the specialization that I have and I deal with is for somebody with a mental health condition, right? So then if I look at clinical yoga therapy from this angle, let's say if somebody walks in with anxiety, right, and a generalized anxiety disorder, then there are categories. Is that somebody with panic attacks? Is that somebody with PTSD? Is that somebody with phobia, right? And once I assess and understand this, I would also need to curtail my model of intervention according to that client, right? So if somebody walks in with anxiety, if it's, let's say, a general yoga class, and you say, put them on with Surya Namaskara, but I couldn't do that immediately with somebody who comes in with anxiety, because that could make it worse, right? Or somebody who walks in with anxiety and you say, you need to calm down, so just close your eyes and meditate. It doesn't work at all. In fact, that could be very contraindicative, because somebody with anxiety would have a lot of ruminating thoughts, right? And if you ask them to sit quietly, this could just become even worse,
Mm.
right? So understanding from the mental health perspective, as well as an understanding from the yogic lens, both are important to address this. So if it is a clinical population, is somebody that I deal with my clinical yoga therapy. So ideally, I take them from the stand of disease to make it better and move towards the journey of health, and then move further towards the journey of wellness, right? So that's the entire difference, I think, from a general yoga class or traditional class versus somebody who walks in with therapy. It's also important, I think, for both of these places and teachers or therapists to understand the limitations and the strengths that they both bring into the class or to that space, right? So somebody who is not probably trained in handling a clinical population or a patient, right? Would not be an ideal person to probably guide somebody going through depression or anxiety, right?
Mhm.
Whereas
Yeah.
deal very well with somebody who's a healthy individual, even if they are at the stand of health, to take them towards wellness. So that's the basic difference, I think.
Thank you for sharing that and sharing the difference between clinical yoga as well as traditional yoga. I think it's very well put. So thank you for sharing that. And now I'd like to come into the next question that I have for you in terms of your research. So I was wondering, how has your research contributed to the field of stress disorders and anxiety treatments?
Okay. So I'll just give you a background about my research to start with. So I was looking at exploring the psychotherapeutic potential of yoga philosophy and looking at how that could be built into a counseling framework. Because now, largely, when I say the word yoga, the first thing that people associate with yoga is an asana practice or a physical practice, right? And that's the first thing that comes onto anybody's mind. Even with regard to yoga therapy, with regard to research work, there is a lot of research work that has been done to look at practices of yoga, that is the asanas, the breath work, meditation, and how this has an impact on different psychiatric disorders, right? But the entire aspect of yoga philosophy has largely been unexplored. Whereas the entire yoga philosophy, even if you look at Patanjali Yoga Sutra, who is the father of yoga, and he has 195 sutras that talk about yoga, there's only one sutra that actually talks about the physical practice or asana. Everything else actually deals with the mind, deals with psychology, right? So my research work was to explore this concept and see how it could be ingrained into a counseling framework that's also culturally relevant for an Indian population, right? And this was the work that I did at NIMHANS. And interestingly, what came about from my research is three broad categories when we look at intervention. One is the yoga practice itself, the dimensions of physical practice, breath work, meditation. The other is this whole concept of addressing the mind, the stress through yogic counseling, which was the crux of my research. And we also looked at lifestyle intervention of how it's not about you come on the mat for 1 hour, practice this and go back, right? But essentially, it's about how you can take this back into your day-to-day life. How the rest of the 23 hours is something you can apply this onto your life day in and out. So that's something that my research was looking into. So let's say if somebody with anxiety or stress disorder comes in, and there are certain tools and techniques that I train them with. So it's essentially like having a toolkit in your hand. So the next time that I know that I'm going to get a panic attack, what are the things I can do to ground myself? What is the living philosophy that I can apply on my day-to-day life so that I know that I do not get into that zone of stress or anxiety or fear, right? So yes, so that's largely what my research was looking at. And we're also looking at when it comes to yoga intervention, it's not one size fits all. So we're looking at how it could be individualistic and how it could be holistic. So the entire research work that I did also looked at diagnosing a client individually and holistically, and also giving a treatment module that's very individualized and specific to that person.
Yeah. It sounds very interesting. I think it's much needed, considering like I love how you have like identified the audience that needs it, and then how you kind of broke it down in terms of yoga as well as psychology and kind of blended it together. So thank you for sharing that. And now I have some rapid fire questions for you. And the first question that I'd like to get into is, so I know you kind of touched upon this, but I was wondering, how does your research inform your practice on a daily basis? How does it keep you motivated?
Okay, interesting. So, my practice, it's I think both are really closely associated, right? Because if I'm not updated about what's happening around with regard to my research work or reading up about that, there's not a lot that I can also bring on to my practice, right? Both are related to each other. So keeping myself informed of what's going around, the research work always gives us a blueprint, right? And then the practice is about using this blueprint largely to see how and what I can adapt into my practice. So both of that goes hand in hand, I think, as a researcher as well as a practitioner.
Well said. Thank you for sharing that. And the next question that I have for you is, what are some common myths about mental health that you encounter in your work?
Hmm. Okay. So I think the first thing is stigma associated with it. Right? Because a lot of people, although want to reach out to seek for therapy, there's still a lot of questions running in their mind about, is this right? Is this okay to seek help? Especially when it comes to mental health, I think that's there. Now, of course, there is a lot of awareness, there's a lot of talk going. So we see a shift happening. But
Yeah.
in spite of that, there is still a lot of stigma attached. Right? That's one. I think the other one is about just understanding if, I could ever get better. I think a lot of people have this question of, can I go back to leading a normal life if, I am suffering with a mental health condition right now? That's another myth, I think, about even caregivers sometimes with the client who come in have this question of, will they ever be able to go back to living a normal life? Or this understanding that they cannot. That's another common myth. Um, and I think another myth is also that sometimes people who bring these clients on have this understanding of, is this self-inflicted when it comes to mental health condition, right? When it is any other thing as well, right? If it is diabetes, we understand that yes, diabetes is a metabolic disorder. It can happen due to your lifestyle. There are certain things, there are a lot of various factors that could lead to it. But when it comes to mental health, I think the larger belief or the myth is that this is just your own doing. Maybe you've brought this onto yourself, which is not true. Because even with regard to mental health conditions, there are so many factors that could influence and bring about this disorder.
Yeah.
So a lot of people think that it's not real, right? But there are so many components contributing to it, and it's not self-inflicted. So that's another common myth I think people come with. With regard to, apart from that, I think another myth with regard to mental health and yoga is again the understanding of yoga just as a physical practice. Right, because I do deal with clinical yoga therapy. I see a lot of people who come in and who don't understand that, and they say, oh, we didn't know that yoga could be applied for a mental health condition, because we thought it's all about exercising, or it's all about getting thinner or fitter.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a common myth that I see, because, again, like you asked me, a lot of people, I think, do not know the difference between general yoga practice and clinical yoga therapy. So, an understanding of that is something that is required. Awareness about that is something that's required. And I think great job with what you're doing, because I think that's what you're aiming to do as well, with spreading awareness about these things.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And the next question that I have for you is, how do you encourage clients to incorporate mindfulness into their daily lives?
Mhm. Okay. So, so even with the sessions that I take right now, when I look at, I do sessions for people going through anxiety disorders, stress disorders, right? And at least once in a week, we have these sessions, which is introspective. And some things that we do is, let's say I ask them to come up with one activity
Yeah.
which is personal to them. And let's say where they could involve all their sense organs into it to make it mindful, right? So some of my clients who've told me that they've made even something as simple as sipping your tea can be a very mindful activity, right? So let's say you just come with your cup of tea, no gadgets around you, keep your phones away. You're having that cup of tea, you're looking at your tea, the color of your tea, you're smelling your tea, right? And then you take that sip, and then you listen to that sound of the sip of the tea that you're taking in, right? So something just as simple as having your tea can be a very mindful activity that you can get into, right?
Yeah.
So then we encourage, and we encourage each other, we encourage the entire client, the participants there, to pick any activity like this that they want to, which they can practice and do this one activity mindfully every day, right? And that's enough to start with. I think one activity where you're completely drawn, all your sensory organs are into that, and then you do one activity like that every day and see how you feel. So some of them tell me, so one client of mine had picked up brushing his teeth as his mindful activity. And he said, I never thought, because I'm just brushing my teeth without any awareness day in and day out. But when I started doing it mindfully, I realized that, am I with the entire sense of, am I doing it right? Where is my brush moving? Which teeth am I cleaning? Which tooth is, So I think a lot of awareness comes in, or we realize that a lot of, most of the times we're on this autopilot mode. We're doing all of our chores that we normally do. So even a simple chore, a day-to-day chore, can be done very mindfully, something that we talk about in these sessions and we start practicing them.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for sharing that. And I think as simple as just observing your tea, I think that could make a huge difference. I think in like the digital time and age, a lot of people are like kind of closely associated with their cell phones and their devices that they're not really paying attention to what's going on around them. So I think that's really important. So thank you for sharing that. And so that is the end of our questions. So thank you for joining me on the 63rd episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. It has been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope we're able to do this again because I found our conversation very insightful. I really enjoyed learning about clinical yoga as well as its association with mental health. It's something that I found insightful, and I hope our listeners who's yet to listen to this also find it insightful as well. So thank you so much for joining me once again, Dr. Raksha, and thank you to everyone who has yet to listen to the 63rd episode of the Inside the Minds of Great Yogis podcast. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Raksha.